So the last video for January 30th that will conclude the sort of heavy Excel only section of the last 2 weeks and allow us to begin pivoting back into um, GIS next week is going to be around using something called a pivot table. So if we've spent the last 2 weeks learning kind of nuances about how data is organized in Excel, rows and columns, how to visually represent the appearance of data, how to perform certain functions to tell you new information about the data or to clean and manage it. The sort of end result is okay, well, you've done all that, you've got a good data set. Well, now how do you actually derive some conclusions from it? And this is the same process that we'll use for the rest of the semester in GIS. GIS in all forms, but especially for urban planning and real estate, is a balance between finding data, cleaning and managing data, and analyzing data. And none of the three can exist independent of one another. And so, if I use, which I'm going to the example that we just cleaned right here, this sort of one that I messed with and I extracted year and quarter. And I separated the names and the title and the department, and I turned salary into a number. It's hard to see now, but there's actually a lot I can do with this. It's overwhelming in its current state because it's 40 or 440,000 individual combinations of year and job title and department. But if I begin to start to mush this down by shared values, I can begin to look at trends year over year, or I can begin to see how different titles in different departments have different salary numbers, or I can begin to see how they're growing and changing in different departments over time. And you do that with what's called a pivot table, which ultimate goal is to take a massive amount of data and condense it down to let you quickly perform summaries by shared values. And that's the key, is that you'll see police department, water department, common pleas court multiple times here, right? It doesn't matter that there is 440,000 records. Those things are repeating regularly. So the way to create any pivot table is you'll select all the rows you want to analyze from the top down. So making sure you're incorporating all values. Now, I think it's on insert for you. I can't exactly remember where it is on a Windows. If you're using a Mac, it's data pivot table. But again, if it's on insert or review for you, it's just insert pivot table. Only key thing with this you want to make sure is that any pivot table you create, it's always easier to put it on a new worksheet. So it'll take a second to sort of pivot and load it at first. Just give it a moment. Very good. So I've got my pivot here. I can click out and call it pivot. When I click back in sort of this area, you should have a little box that pops up. If you don't see the box, it's somewhere on the top. You'll see sort of a ribbon, even if it's not in the same place as mine that says pivot table. Just open it and find the window called Builder. Builder is always the one that lets you kind of quickly see the interface. And the interface has 4 pieces: a filter, columns, rows, and values. Filter we'll use maybe once or twice, and really its point is if I want to just see only some kind of data. Right? If I was only interested in seeing the police department or the recreation department or the water department or physicians, directors, and clerks, I can quickly filter so that any data that comes back to me is only showing those pieces. That'll become clear in a second once I demonstrate rows. Rows is probably the most important element that you have. Rows is going to take your data, it's going to depict it in rows, but what it's going to do is it's going to condense it into those rows based on common shared values. So, like I said, the same kinds of departments appear over and over again. And so when I put department down, what was once 440,000 rows has come down to 57. There are 57 different position types. in Philadelphia government. So that's pretty cool. So having that open, I can begin to play around in here with this concept of a value. So maybe first thing I'll do is just drag any field, because the first thing typically, and it might be different on yours, especially if you drag a field that's not numeric, is it defaults itself to count. If it doesn't, if it's trying to do a sum or something weird, you could always click on this info, or it might be right click or a drop down for you, and just choose that concept of count. And I'll kind of go through some of the other statistics in a second. But what this is showing is that, the Department of Board and Building and Standards, there's 69 unique combinations of year, quarter, person, and job type. Right, so that's pretty cool. Maybe I could actually summarize it by year, right? I could actually bring the year into the filter, and here's that example I was mentioning before, and what if I turned off 2016 and 2018? Then what I'd actually be having is, right, in a given year, the Board and Building and Standards has 29 different jobs, right? It's going to have 29 different titles to a different person with a salary attached to it. Versus in 2017, it was going to have, 20. And the cool thing is I can handle that up here in a filter if I want to, continue to reduce my data. But there's also the interesting point of bringing something to a column. And anytime you bring something to a column, it pushes it this way. So now what I'm seeing is the total number of jobs that I'll have a salary for in each year in each department, right? I might be able to use this as a proxy for how much they're sort of growing. So that's pretty cool. Now, count is cool, but what if I actually wanted to start looking at the average, right? That seems the thing we built towards, this concept of getting a salary number, clicking on it and doing average, right? And now, right, if I select all these rows, turn them into dollars. Now I'm getting to the point where I can actually see in each department the average salary for a given year and how it's gone up or how it's gone down. I can build beyond that even too, right? I could also look at the department and the title. Even more information, right? It continues to drag when I drag it under. So now in the airport department, an accountant on average makes $47,000 in 2016 and $50,000 in 2018. That's great. I mean, this is like really good information. Now, anytime you're playing with data, it's always important whenever you pivot and you're doing averages or mins and max, you be aware of the numbers that are fueling this. And remember, it's important that there's some stuff over here that has a zero, and typically the stuff that has a zero is when it's like summer, or more probationary ones. We just don't have information. And it's not that this person is paid zero, but that zero is going into the equation. And so there's no hard science to this, but know your data sets, right? If there's going to be values that are sort of screwing up the analysis, right? Any zero we have is bringing down our analysis here because we just don't have the information for it because it's not an annual salary number that is in here. We might want to sort of get a pivot field here where we can remove it. And, so we can set that up actually really easy with what's called like an if query. So why don't we set up, a salary filter. And quite literally set up like this. Hey, if u equals 0, then we'll say no salary. That's the value of true, comma, salary. That's the value of false. No, that is not spelled correctly. Let me fix that. And so now if we copy this over and all the way down, now I have sort of an easy on or off field, right? It's easier to filter that than it would be to filter salary number, because if I drag salary number into the filter, I think it's actually better. This may be one of those nuances I had to fix for Mac Excel. I think you're given better options in filters with numbers to do like a greater than or less than. But if it doesn't ever default to that, then it's almost like you'd have thousands of individual numbers to filter in and out, and you'd have to just pick one with a 0. Versus this, it's much easier to sort of filter one value on or off. Now, the cool thing about pivot tables is they can constantly grow, right? So I'm building the number of rows, and it doesn't immediately appear like anything changed. I don't see a filter category here. Just know that anytime you grow a pivot table like that, you have to come back to this sort of pivot table option menu and hit refresh. And when you hit refresh all, and refresh any pivot table working with this data, and then boom, there it is, right? Salary filter suddenly appeared. I can drag it in here, and I can get sort of a more accurate reading here by taking away no salary. Right, so then things change slightly. It doesn't make it immense, but it certainly gets rid of any of those instances where there's sort of a zero that might be weighing things down. So last thing, we've been looking at this largely from a layout perspective that is kind of compact, meaning that when we drag multiple fields together, it builds itself into sort of like a drop-down menu. You could also go to tabular under layout and make sure you click on these and say, none. You want to make sure there's no sort of sum that's happening. And the difference that we're having here is now actually I can see each one as its own individual row. And this may be helpful, if you want to copy and paste some of this data out. I'm only going to just take a snippet. I'll come down maybe to here. Atwater Kent Museum and drag it up. And sort of now what I've pivoted is I've almost like removed the year, right? I've made a slightly less data than I had before. The year is no longer a part of the row. The year is sort of up here, right? So I have the department, the title, 2016, 2017, 2018. And now I've sort of changed the context of my data. Now I'm actually looking at it in sort of a row and column, and I can use it for other types of analytics. The last thing I'll leave you with that may not even be necessary for you, I think pivot tables are smarter on Windows than they are in mine, so you may actually have an option, or it just may automatically duplicate that row. It doesn't do it on Mac for some reason, and that's problematic, right? Because what this actually thinks is that it's not part of a department. But really what it is it's part of the airport and commerce. It's just structured in a way that anything below this defaults to what's above. And there's a cool trick in Excel you can do that if you select all kinds of rows that are blank, and you come up to edit, you can do go to, say special, and pick blanks. The cool thing is it's only going to select the blanks. And now if I say, hey, equal, just do it for the first row only, equal what's above me, hold control and hit enter. It's going to fill it in everywhere down, and most importantly, anytime it gets to a new value, arts and cultures, it fills in that value. So this is just a good way, if your data is structured like this, that it has the first row contains the value that belongs in every row below it, but it's showing up as blank. This is just a quick and easy way how I'll copy and paste special to get that value out. So that's the basics of a pivot table, and you can use it for sort of any piece of data that you find as long as it's set up in rows and columns. But it allows you to take usually very large data sets and derive new conclusions from them that you couldn't see normally by just viewing the data in its total form.